Good morning, everybody. I'm here to give you another lesson. It is now our 5th lesson in our series on the Ten Commandments, the basis for morality and why they're still relevant in 2020. Now, interestingly, to this point, the early part of the Ten Commandments really covers the vertical crossbeam in our relationships, and so specifically our relationship with God, about the position that He should take, that there should be no other gods before Him, not to make any graven images, not to take His name in vain. And then the intersection, the cross member, is the time of the Sabbath, which is both a time of honoring God, but also it's about our own interpersonal relationships, about ourselves, and then also our interaction with our community. The rest of the commandments deal with the horizontal relationships, and so specifically our relationships with other people. And it's worth noting that the majority of the commandments fall into this category. Ultimately, the breakdown of all of this, as Jesus pointed out, it all rests upon two things: to love God with your whole being and to love your neighbor as yourself. And really, if we could perform those two commandments perfectly, if we could love God perfectly, if we could love our fellow man perfectly, we wouldn't need any other biblical instruction. But of course, the reality is that we don't do either of those things perfectly, and as a byproduct of that, we are given a lot more specifics to help us in fulfilling these very basic principles. But I did want to point out to you that we've looked at the vertical crossbeam of our relationship with God, and now we're starting into the horizontal crossbeam of our relationship with other people. And of course, the cross is where it all leads to in our lives. And so in this particular commandment, we're looking at the principle to honor our parents. So we'll start in the passage from the Old Testament. We're going to add a New Testament passage as well. So let's look at Exodus chapter 20 and verse 12. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long upon the land which the Lord your God is giving you. And then in Ephesians chapter 6, verses 2 through 3, honor your father and mother, quote that's given from the Old Testament, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with you and you may live long on the earth. So interestingly, this is the first commandment according to Scripture that is given with promise. And so in Ephesians, of course, Paul has been dealing with a series of relationship talk. And so in chapter 5, he's talking about husband and wife relationships. In chapter 6, he explores parent-child relationships along with certain servant-master relationships. Even you could call it servant-employer or employer-employee relationships as a part of that. So it's a study of these fundamental relationships that have to balance the power, the authority, and the responsibility of one party. In this case, it would be husbands, parents, or masters, with the submission, obedience, and respect of the other party, be it wives, children, and servants. And so a lot of, if you deal with marriage seminars, a lot of marriage counsel ends up dealing with the tension between the love that a husband owes his wife and the respect that a wife owes her husband. And I don't have time to get into all of that today, but essentially what God commands us to do is to do the thing that is, number one, the greatest felt need of our spouse. Above all, wives need to feel that they are loved, they're cherished, they're romantically pursued. And above all, husbands need to feel that they are respected in their position as leader of the home, and also some respect for the sacrifices that they make for the good of the family unit. And so there is a similar principle at work here as Paul addresses the parent-child relationship. So let me give you this in a little bit of a greater context, and then we'll jump back to the Old Testament. Ephesians chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with you and you may live long on the earth. And you, fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord. So children are to obey their parents for two reasons. Number one, in the Lord. So as a principle of being a Christian, that we're doing things as under the Lord. And so, in other words, we're operating within the proper authority structure and submitting ourselves to authority, which is one of those key principles that you just can't get away from, no matter how much you might dislike it. The very reality is that all of us have to be in a spirit of submission. And if you do not submit yourselves to God, you cannot resist the devil and he will flee from you. You can't get one without the other. Your authority that you bear comes by submitting to the authority of God. And so authority flows through power structures, and Christ is the head. In this situation, children are to respect God's power hierarchy within the family unit. The children are to obey their parents in the Lord. And secondly, for this is right. It is a basic fundamental truth that we are to recognize, that the whole family structure falls apart if there isn't obedience that comes from parents. And of course that needs to be balanced between the proper relationship from the parent to the children as well. Now at some point, however, there is a natural transition that has to take place in the maturation process of every child. All of us are children in the sense that we all have parents. But at some point, the authority structure shifts to where, as we start to become our own family unit, we can no longer remain under the hierarchy of our previous family unit. And so the command from the beginning for husbands and wives is that they are to leave their father and mother, to the man to leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife and to become one flesh, so to form a new family unit. And so inherent in that is the recognition that at some point there is a shift from obeying our parents into becoming the parents or becoming that new family unit. And when that takes place, the shift in the language becomes that while we no longer owe our parents obedience, in that we're no longer their children under their protection and thus their hierarchy of authority, but rather we owe them honor and respect. We are to honor our parents. And so, no longer is the commandment for us to obey our parents. And by the way, there's some gray area that often gets abused in this. I found that, for example, there are some situations in which parents try to still control their grown adult children and to treat them as if they're still children under their roof, under their power hierarchy or structure. That's not right. What you're doing actually is you're meddling in the lives of them becoming fully functional adults. And so if you're on the parent end of the equation, you need to recognize that there is a natural preordained design that God has, that your children grow up and they start to form their own family units. They don't remain under your headship. You're not the don, the mafioso, the head of the family, to where your word remains law. And if you try to enforce that, you're actually going to create dysfunction for your own children's families as they try to forge that. And likewise with children, there needs to be a point where you grow up and you start to accept responsibility. There's this natural process to where you need to stop looking to your parents to solve all of your problems and to meet your every need. And so this is a recognition of the proper dynamic that should be inherent in relationships. And so there comes a point where it's not obey your parents anymore, but rather it is to honor your parents. So let's dive into what that means a little bit more. So what does honor actually mean? Well, particularly within the Christian family unit, and that's really the family unit that we're looking at right now, honor is a recognition, number one, I think, of the importance of recognizing what your parents have done for you. There's an unfortunate, very common trend that takes place amongst popular psychology. And what that does is that very often as people try to deal with, their own dysfunction in their own lives, they're often, one of the first series of questions they're asked is about their childhood. And very often it's looking for some kind of childhood trigger that explains behaviors in the present. And I think that there's a lot of validity to that. However, what often happens is that people get stuck in that stage where they begin to blame their parents for all that's wrong with them. And in the process of that, they get stuck psychologically themselves to where instead of honoring their parents, they're instead just blaming them as if everything that they have ever failed at or done wrong in their lives is their parents' fault. And I've seen, unfortunately, this situation take place, and it's quite ugly because in many cases it's very obvious that people have made their own destructive choices, but they want to blame it all on someone else, and their parents are an easy one to blame as a part of that. And in that, there's often not a recognition of the very realities that their parents had to deal with. The truth of the matter is that there are no perfect parents. I'm not one of them, to be certain. And the reason why we're not perfect parents is that unfortunately, we're all not just dealing with raising our children, we're also dealing with all the other aspects of life. And so all the other pressures of life, all the other responsibilities of life, there are times that you go through your own personal crises as a part of, maybe it's hitting a certain, age, or, you're dealing with dynamics within your marriage that you're having to solve. And so a lot of times the dysfunction that does exist in parents is due to the fact that parenting isn't their full-time gig. They're dealing with a lot of other stuff, work stuff, life stuff as well. And so I think it's really important to recognize that your parents are not two-dimensional characters. They are three-dimensional, fully fleshed out real people, which means that they had to deal with their own stuff, their own pressures in life, their own health crises and work crises and marital issues along the way. And the byproduct of that is it's a fallen, imperfect world, and even good parents are fallen, imperfect people. And so yes, it's fair to look at assess our childhood and to recognize where those triggers might have come from. But let's not get stuck in the blame game, because yes, our parents are imperfect, but look in the mirror, we're also imperfect people ourselves, parenting imperfectly in the present. And so I think that honoring your parents is a recognition of the sacrifice that they gave. And if you are a parent, you know how much sacrifice is involved with being a parent. But it's equally important for you to recognize the sacrifices that your own parents made for you. And even if they were not good parents, taking as a whole, I think it's important in the pursuit of honoring your parents to look for and to recognize the areas where they did do good by you, and to honor and to respect that, to esteem their input into your lives. But there is also another key aspect of this that is being upheld in Scripture, and that is about the continuity of things being passed from one generation to another. I think the most obvious example of this comes towards the end of World War II. There is a generation that's often referred to as the greatest generation. And they were those that post-war, a terrible, awful war, they came back, particularly here in North America, and they built up the economies of the United States and Canada into being powerhouses. And they came home, and despite all that they had faced in war, they came home and they built things, they advanced technology, and they did all of this while having a certain amount of values that were pretty steadfast at that point. What happens in the 1960s is we have this new movement that comes with a rejection of all the values of that generation. And so as a part of that, you have free love, you have free sex, you have drug experimentation, you have no-fault divorce, you have all kinds of acts of rebellion that takes place. As that generation, they rejected the value of the previous generation. But here's the deal. Nobody calls that subsequent generation the greatest generation. In fact, from there we see a decay that has unfortunately continued in a downward spiral to where right now in many major cities there is chaos in the streets, there's anarchy. We have seen a rampant spread of immorality and pushing things that are so antithetical to God's word and to the foundations of our nation. And so what we see is there was something that was broken. There was a line of succession that was severed along the way to where one generation completely rejected their parents and their value system. They did not honor their parents. They did not look for the value in what their parents had fought for and stood for, but instead they rejected wholesale those. And the byproduct of that was the beginnings of chaos and disorder that were sown into our society. So that is part of what honoring of our parents talks about. It's about preserving the values, family values passed on from generation to generation. This, of course, was incredibly important for the nation of Israel, for they were to be God's showcase people, God's chosen people, and to showcase His values, His law, His culture to the world. And so if things were lost, and we see periods of biblical history where things were lost, and when that happened, it was chaos for the nation, because not only did the nation of Israel suffer, but their witness to the rest of the world suffered. They had nothing to offer the world. And that, of course, is the lesson that is here for us today as Christian parents or as Christian families. We need to uphold something precious that is passed from generation to generation. There are things that I inherited I was born very fortunately into this truth. I was raised in a Christian home. And so there were values that were passed on to me that I need to honor my parents, respecting the value that they gave to me. And the best way to honor them is by passing on that value to another generation. I'm not going to be a carbon copy of my parents. I'm a distinct individual, and that's true of you as well in relation to your parents. But hopefully we can all be wise enough to recognize the things of worth that we inherited that we want to pass on to another generation. And that is there in that promise that if we will do this, then our days will be long upon the land. And the promise was for the nation of Israel that if they kept passing on these values, they would continue to receive God's blessing and favor that would allow them to remain in the land. And we see that when they abandoned those principles, that there was a breakdown and they went into captivity. I think that we need to learn that lesson today, that if we want to receive that promise that God has for us, that promise of God's favor and God's blessing, we need to hang on to some precious values, and we need to make sure to honor our parents, honor those values, and pass them on to another generation. Let me conclude on this note. I frankly sometimes tire of hearing people talk about how great it was back in the old days. And, they'll talk about, how wonderful church used to be and how people used to pray and how people used to praise and all of these things. And it's often done with this tenor of indictment towards the present generation. But I don't think that we're really honoring our parents by just saying, looking back in these rose-colored glasses, it was so great back in their day. But rather it is, we need to look at, what was it that was great about those days? And to be honest about that, by the way, not just, pretend like everything was perfect. It wasn't. But to look at what was so precious, what was so valuable, instead of saying, I wish we had that today. Let's have it today. Let's honor our parents by passing on those values, by recreating those values. And so if you are lamenting, how people used to pray, are you praying like that yourself? I remember how people used to worship. Well, are you worshiping like that yourself? Don't just lament what has been lost, but honor what has gone before by taking those values and bringing them into the present right now. And that is how we pass on the value from generation to generation. And we do not lose that precious link of when we start to dishonor our parents. I pray that this has spoken to you in some way and given you some insight into a commandment that maybe doesn't always feel relevant to you as an adult, but I think it actually is. And so let's hide that in our hearts, and let's make sure to pass on to the next generation something of value, and they in turn hopefully can honor us as well. God bless you. Have a blessed, wonderful day.